We're back. It's Star Wars Starship Versus time. I decided to go through some of my past videos, find the most upvoted suggestions for future matchup requests, and this was certainly one of them. Today, the Bellator class Super Star Destroyer from Star Wars Legends is facing off against the Resurgent, the First Order Star Destroyer in canon. Now, definitely an interesting matchup here because we've got two very different ships from timelines which have actually significantly diverged technologically. I'll do a breakdown of both ships, but just to set the scene, in short, the Bellator is obviously significantly more massive than the Resurgent, but even if they existed in the same timeline, the Resurgent would be several decades newer, and the First Order in Star Wars canon arguably see a greater technological jump compared to the Imperial era than any faction in Star Wars Legends. So, as you know, if you've watched these videos before, I'm going to do a breakdown first of each ship, then at the end I'll give my opinion on who would win. Alright, we'll start with the Bellator, and this is actually a very interesting ship, which doesn't actually have a ton of hard information in Star Wars Legends. The Bellator actually was designed based off a comic from Dark Empire. As Jason Fry explains in his blog related to the Essential Guide to Warfare, the Bellator came out of what he calls a humpbacked vessel as pictured in Dark Empire 2. It was later modeled by a friend of the channel, Fractal Sponge, and that model ended up making its way into the Essential Guide to Warfare, and his design as well would be canonized. The official numbers for the Bellator, again from Jason Fry, put it at just over 7 kilometers, with the ship actually being a very unique vessel within the Imperial Navy. I've talked about the Mandator line of dreadnoughts before. The Bellator was sort of an offshoot cousin. Whereas the Mandator 3 scaled up the Clone Wars era Mandator 2 design, bringing it to over 12 kilometers, the Bellator did the opposite, instead providing a somewhat fast and mobile Super Star Destroyer. Jason Fry says specifically that the Bellator is a rethinking of the humpbacked Mandator and Mandator 2 class dreadnoughts, which are slightly longer. Known in the Imperial military as a fast dreadnought, the Bellator sacrifices firepower for speed. One of the issues when doing a versus for this vessel is that we don't actually have real numbers regarding the firepower. And I say real when I really should say official, because the nice thing about the Bellator is that it was, of course, designed by the extremely talented Fractal Sponge, and he modeled all the weapons, or at least most of them, so theoretically you can blow up one of his models and count every single gun. Now, whether that's the canon interpretation of the Bellator, even though they used his model, who cares really? If you go on the Wikipedia page for the Bellator, it does link to some of his original discussions when making the ship back in 2008 through forum threads on stardestroyer.net. He says that he envisions the Bellator as about a quarter of the Executor's power and actually gives a breakdown of each weapon type. For example, he has 16 of the super heavy double turbo lasers, 48 of the heavy quad lasers, plus missile launchers and laser cannons, which you wouldn't be able to see because they're probably either too small or within the ship itself. Also worth noting is that the ship has some extremely heavy-duty turreted ion cannons, which is kind of a classic of Fractal Sponge's designs. The Bellator has a massive reactor, and again, according to Fractal Sponge, outputs the energy of several dozen Star Destroyers. But let's now talk the Resurgent Star Destroyer. Unlike the Bellator, which has actually, I believe anyway, made its way to canon, the Resurgent is unique to the one continuity. It is, of course, the main battleship of the First Order. It comes in at nearly 3 kilometers long and represents basically the peak of starship technology in Star Wars canon. The Resurgent aimed to improve on the Imperial design, making it not only significantly larger, but also just better overall. I will say, as someone who loves the design of the Resurgent, I'd really like to see more canon lore on the ship, and really the First Order Navy in general. Still, the best source is probably the one I've been using since I started YouTube, which is the incredible cross-sections for Episode 7. It describes the Finalizer in particular, but all Resurgent-class Star Destroyers really, as both devastating weapons platforms and highly effective carriers. I'm not even going to talk about starfighters in this battle because I don't think it matters. But the Star Destroyer also makes design improvements to aspects like the bridge, protecting it further against enemy starfighters, while offering over 3,000 turbo lasers, laser cannons, and ion cannons. For those who don't know, turbo lasers are the big guns, laser cannons better for starfighters, ion cannons take down shields. I will note, when you look at the Finalizer or Resurgent classes generally, you don't see the same very large-scale weapons that the Bellator has, and that's probably just due to the sheer size that the mini Dreadnought has to work with. Some Resurgent classes, but not all, have been upgraded with kyber crystals, making their cannons even more powerful. I'll say for the purposes of this video that, sure, this one does as well. The Resurgent was also a very fast ship with dedicated reactors for the engines only, but how will it face off against the Bellator? And this is a pretty easy one in my opinion. Even with the technological advantage, the Resurgent is just facing too much of an uphill battle. When you think of the size difference between the Resurgence and the Bellator, sure, on one hand, yes, it's 4 kilometers, but that only tells a portion of the story. When it comes to volume, the ship's innards, the generating capacity, you're talking like 10 times the amount for the larger ship, and several times the surface area. And in this type of matchup, when we're talking 2 massive ships bristling with weapons, this will be a slugfest. You know, this isn't an MC-80 holding off against a Star Destroyer as the X-Wings try to take down the shield. No. This is 2 vessels bristling with weapons where the fastest way for them to kill each other is simply pure firepower. I think that Fractal Sponge focus on the Bellator's super heavy weapons make this an even clearer victory. If you look just again at the surface of these ships, and even if you look at other cross sections for the Resurgent, it's just clear that the Bellator has much heavier weaponry, especially with those ion cannons, and I don't think any magical increase due to technology or kyber crystals or whatever will help bridge that gap. You know, in Star Wars, when a ship loses its shield, it starts taking heavy damage. You start losing systems. I think that this one, just because of how fast the battle will fall apart for the Resurgent, goes to the Bellator, which walks away with a fairly clean victory. The Resurgent is probably faster, but in this situation, I don't think it matters. But the great thing about these types of videos is this is just my opinion. If you disagree, I hope you'll let me know down below. Do so nicely. I'm very, very sensitive. And of course, I'd like to do more of these versus videos, sort of get back to the roots. So if there's a matchup you'd like me to see, you'd like me to make, you'd like to see yourself, let me know. But that's all I've got. Until next time, be safe, have a good one, and may the Force be with you.